What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the Nokia G400 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first pro for the Nokia G400 5G is the battery. Now with this phone, we are getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 20-watt fast charging. And with such a large battery, you can definitely expect to get great battery life and longevity here. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're not always around a charger, but you really need a phone that's actually going to last all day, the Nokia G400 is going to be a great choice for that situation. In addition to this, with 20-watt fast charging, although this isn't the best fast charging in the world, for a phone you can get for less than $300, it's definitely pretty good. And in my experience, the charging speeds are great as well. Another really cool thing about the charging with this phone is that on one hand, in order to actually take full advantage of the fast charging, you will need a good fast charger. And nowadays, most phones don't even come with a wall adapter, let alone an actual fast charger. But with the Nokia G400 5G, we actually do get a pretty decent fast charger, so that's definitely a nice thing to see. My second pro for the Nokia G400 5G is that it has NFC. Now on one hand, this isn't really an uncommon feature per se, but considering again, you can get this phone for less than $300, while there are a lot of phones, mostly Samsungs, that do have NFC in this price range, there is still plenty of phones that don't. So if you are looking for more of an entry-level 5G phone and you do want to be able to use tap and pay, then again, keep in mind the Nokia G400 5G does have NFC, so you will be able to use that feature just fine. My third pro for the Nokia G400 5G is the camera. To give you a quick rundown of the features, we got a water drop notch up here for the front-facing camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So as far as features go, although we're not getting exactly everything with this phone, at least it does have an ultra-wide camera, which is a really useful feature if you're taking a lot of photos. In addition to this, with a 48 megapixel camera, you can definitely get some great quality photos. So while on one hand, of course, the quality you're going to get with this phone is not going to be anywhere near what you're going to get with something like a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, for a mid-range phone, the quality is definitely really good. And for the average user, if you're just taking a few photos, maybe to share on social media, for example, the camera we're getting with this phone will absolutely get the job done. Another interesting thing here is when it comes to video, while this phone does max out at 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K unfortunately, you can actually record at 60 frames per second with this phone, whereas most mid-range phones, including ones significantly more expensive than this one, can only record at 30 frames per second. So getting a slightly higher frame rate is definitely a nice thing. So if you are recording a decent amount of videos with this phone, although again, unfortunately, you can't record 4K videos, you will at least get pretty good quality here. My fourth pro for the Nokia G400 5G is the display. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.58-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 401, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So at 6.58 inches, sure, on one hand, it's not one of those enormous displays that feels like a tablet, but on the other hand, it is decently large, and if you're consuming a lot of content, you will get a pretty good experience here. With a 20:9 aspect ratio, we are getting a taller and more narrow form factor, and this is going to give you a more immersive experience in landscape mode, and when you're doing something like browsing the web, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. And aside from the size and dimensions, the image quality we're getting here is great as well. With a 1080p resolution, everything is going to be nice and sharp. The colors are also decently bright and vibrant, and with a 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother. And this is great if you're doing something like watching a video or playing a game, and even if you're just using the phone in general, things are going to feel more premium overall. So the bottom line here is, if you're looking for an entry-level 5G phone that has a great display, you will be happy with the Nokia G400 5G. And finally, my fifth pro for the Nokia G400 5G is the overall design. Now on one hand, this phone doesn't look like the most premium thing in the world, but I do think for what it is, it does have a pretty nice looking design that on one hand isn't doing too much, but on the other hand does look at least nice and decently interesting. I definitely do like the back material, and although as you can clearly see it does pick up some fingerprints, I do think it looks pretty nice in general. On the front, although we have a slightly thicker bottom bezel, I do like how they included the Nokia logo right here, and even though the phone does have a water drop notch for the selfie camera instead of a hole punch, which typically looks a little bit better, in the context of this phone, I do feel like the overall design, while again not being really premium or anything, does look pretty nice for what it is. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some of the drawbacks. So my first con for the Nokia G400 5G is that there's no macro camera. Now this is really too bad because other than this, the camera setup has pretty much everything else, and again the photo quality is great. But if you are someone who likes to get those close-up detailed images. Then again, since we're not getting a macro camera here, unfortunately those pictures are going to be pretty hard to get. So if you are taking a lot of photos and you really want all the features including a macro camera, then while I do still think the camera setup we're getting here is pretty good for what it is, if you do really want everything, then this phone might not be the best choice for you. My second con for the Nokia G400 5G is the processor. Now with this phone, we're getting 4GB of RAM with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. When it comes to performance, on one hand, for really basic daily activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and some light mobile gaming, don't get me wrong, this phone will get the job done, but compared to most mid-range phones in 2022, I feel like it does fall a little short. So if you're going to be on your phone a lot and performance is really a priority for you, then while the Nokia G400 5G is not terrible by any means, I feel like you can do better for the money. Now I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and this is what I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone's going to be an upgrade for you. You might find that while again, I personally don't really think this is a very fast phone, depending on what you currently have, it still might be a pretty solid upgrade for you. But again, in general, when it comes to the performance, well, once again, I don't think it's terrible with this phone, and for really basic daily activities, it still will get the job done. I just think for a mid-range phone in 2022, you can do a lot better. My third con for the Nokia G400 5G is that it doesn't have stereo audio. Now, in case you don't know what this means, when a phone has stereo audio, if you're doing something like watching a video, for example, sound is going to come out of both the main speaker and the earpiece, giving you a much more immersive experience. But unfortunately, with the Nokia G400 5G, we're not actually getting stereo audio here. So while, of course, this makes no difference to those of you who use headphones all the time, with no stereo audio, the sound quality you get from the phone itself is definitely going to be a little limited. My fourth con for the Nokia G400 5G is the software. Now, this is probably the weakest con in this video because, to be fair, this phone does have Android 12, which is at least decently newer. But that being said, we are going into Android 13, and I'm not sure when or if this phone is actually going to get that update. And even if it does, compared to something like a Samsung, for example, just keep in mind, a Nokia phone like this is not going to have nearly as good software support. So if you're planning on keeping the same phone for a longer period of time, and you are someone who likes to have the latest version of Android, in that kind of situation, this phone might not be the best choice for you. And finally, my fifth con for the Nokia G400 5G is the storage. With this phone, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and on one hand, this isn't really terrible. I mean, for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone and you're not downloading a ton of apps and games and stuff like that, you should be fine, especially with the microSD card expansion, because if you have a lot of photos and videos with a microSD card, that's really not going to be an issue. But that being said, if you are more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and games and stuff like that, in this day and age, 64GB will fill up pretty quickly. So if you are in that kind of situation where you have a lot of stuff on your phone, you might want to get something a little bit higher end that has more storage. But those were my pros and cons for the Nokia G400 5G. In general, despite some drawbacks, I do think this is a pretty good phone for what it is. And overall, if you're looking for an entry-level 5G phone for basic activities that has a really good display, a nice camera setup, and a great battery, the Nokia G400 5G is definitely worth considering. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.